I doubt very much that we have enough time to do all of this today, but we'll see how far we can get. It's There's so few verses in here, and this actually started with Chance asking a question about these three verses and what was going on in them. And last week we looked a little bit at impurities and how that relates to this story. And now we're just going to really focus more on Zipporah. And there are so few verses about her. She only mentioned, I think it's 4 times in all of the Bible. And nonetheless, the questions about her and what she says and what she does are really deep questions. And answering those questions requires digging up a lot of stuff. And so we're going to spend a lot of time getting more information in so we can understand exactly what's happening with Zipporah. And so the story is a wonderful story, and you'll see that once we get to the end. But as a modern rabbi said, it's the strangest story in the Bible, he says. There's nothing like it that is any stranger than that. And after he tried to talk about it, he went on to show that he really didn't understand all of it either, because there are problems with the understanding that he was promoting. So what we're going to do today is we're first going to look at why it is so difficult. Why is this story such a problem for people to understand? And we'll give you some background you need to know to understand that. And not everybody has that background. And secondly, we'll look at the two big mysteries. And these two mysteries are kind of the points that everything hangs on. And once we can resolve those, and we will resolve those and explain how they work, and once you can do that, you can actually understand the rest of it. You can break out the rest of it and make sense of it all. And that's what we'll do lastly. We'll go through the verses and watch how it all plays out once you understand how all the pieces fit together. So it's a difficult passage, and it's difficult because of time in a couple of ways. One thing you need to know is that Moses' life comes in 3 40-year stages. He spends his first 40 years in Egypt as a prince, and then he kills an Egyptian taskmaster and runs away to the land of Midian and spends the next 40 years of his life there. And then God sends him to Egypt, and when he's in Egypt, he frees his fellow Israelites in a series of, well, you know the whole story, I won't go into it. And he spends his last 40 years wandering in the wilderness with them. So he lives a total of 120 years. And at the end of that, he's still vital when God puts him to sleep. And so it's interesting that his life breaks up into these 40-year stages, but understanding that is going to be important to understanding the next problem with time. And that is that this whole story of Zipporah is told without any indication of the passage of time. And it never says that he was here for 2 years, he was here for 3 years. It doesn't say anything like that about time. It doesn't even say that he was here for some period of time. It gives us no hint at time. And that makes it difficult to understand some of the things that go on. And one of them I'll speak about specifically here. During this 40-year Midian period, when Moses is living in the land of Midian, this whole period in time is covered by 3 chapters of Exodus. But half of those 3 chapters is allocated entirely to the burning bush event, where God is discussing with Moses that he wants Moses to go, and Moses is saying, no, I don't want to go, and this goes back and forth. So all of that event uses up a chapter and a half and only leaves us with 1.5 chapters for everything else. And because we have so little verses, so few verses about this whole Zipporah thing, we really are missing pieces that we have to fill in from other places. And so the outcome of having so little to work with is we see the verse about Moses arriving in Midian and meeting Jethro. And so here's that verse from Exodus 2, 21, 22. It's actually 2 verses, but the first one is the most important one. And so they say, Moses was willing to dwell with the man, that's Jethro, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Then she gave birth to a son. Now, when you would normally read that, you say, okay, there's a very short period of time here. But in fact, what's happening is that verse 21, the first verse here, covers a period of nearly 40 years. And there's no hint of that at all. But we know that that's true because when Moses and Zipporah go to Egypt, she and both the boys can ride together on one donkey, and they're called boys. And so we know that they are very young. You couldn't get 3 men or the 2 men and a woman onto a donkey. And so for that to work, you really had to have 2 young boys for them to fit on the donkey with Zipporah. So by putting that information in, we can see that it wasn't possible for Zipporah to have given birth immediately after she was given to Moses. And so there has to be, in these 2 verses, a nearly 40-year period. And that nearly 40-year period actually fits in right about here in the verse. And so Moses agreed to dwell with Jethro in his household. And then almost 40 years later, Jethro gives his daughter Zipporah to Moses, and then she gives birth to a son. So, um, and so that makes it difficult. If you don't understand what's going on there, then you're going to have trouble later on when you see him heading down into Egypt with boys, and the circumcision involves a boy as well. And so those things don't seem to make sense if you don't understand what's going on here. And the other thing that makes this passage difficult is just that it is difficult. And because it's difficult for other people are making it more difficult for other people to understand it because they are misunderstanding it. And so translators and teachers who don't understand it are translating it and teaching it the wrong way. And they're teaching it to what they can understand because they don't understand all of it. And so when they do that, that messes up everyone else who has no foundation in Hebrew and makes it hard for them to understand what's really going on. And so they teach something that they can understand, which is close to it, but it doesn't really match up. And so what translators want is a nice, simple circumcision story. They want to be an ordinary circumcision like all other circumcisions. And so they want to see the story this way. God is very angry with Moses because Moses hasn't circumcised his son. And so Zipporah circumcises his son, and everything is good. End of the story. But that leaves a whole bunch of blanks, a whole bunch of unanswered questions. And it isn't ordinary because it doesn't explain a bunch of things. It doesn't explain why God is so upset that he wants to kill Moses. And I was watching that rabbi that I mentioned earlier, a video on that, and his focus was all on that question. Why is God so angry about this? Why is this such a big deal? It wasn't such a big problem for anybody else who didn't circumcise their son. Now, yes, normally you would expect the son to be circumcised, and so there's a question there. But why is God so upset? And so it doesn't explain that, and it doesn't explain that the covenant doesn't require the father to do the circumcision. So why is he angry with only Moses? Why isn't he also angry with Zipporah? And so circumcision wasn't the duty of the father or the mother. In fact, in most Jewish families right now, when they go to have their child circumcised, they take them to the church, and the church has the tools to do that. So, and so the covenant makes the individual responsible for his own circumcision, really. It says that at 8 days he should be circumcised, but if he isn't, it's really up to him to make sure that he is circumcised. And otherwise, he's kind of out of the community. So, and so it doesn't explain why Moses does and says nothing when God is angry. And so here is God fiercely angry, seeking to kill Moses for this. And Moses doesn't do anything. He doesn't say anything. And we know that Zipporah is the one who does the circumcision, but a circumcision takes time. It isn't something you can just snap your fingers and it's done. So she would have had to go off and get the tools. It says that she's using a stone knife, a flint knife in some translations. So she goes off and gets this, and she gets the other tools that are necessary for cutting the foreskin off. And she does this work and cleans up after it and takes the foreskin. So it wasn't something that was done quickly. It would have taken a few hours probably. And so Moses doesn't do or say anything in here, and here's God angry with him. So that's kind of strange too. And it doesn't explain probably two of the most critical things here is why is Zipporah throwing the foreskin at Moses' feet? A lot of translations say that she throws the foreskin at his feet, but the Hebrew doesn't say that. The Hebrew actually says that she touches his feet with it. Okay, and so some translator bias here, they want to see it as she's throwing the foreskin at him, but they can't explain why. But because if she touches his feet with it, that really indicates that this circumcision is not about the boy, it's about Moses. There's some reason why she feels it's necessary to touch his feet with the foreskin that's been cut off of the boy. And we talked about the reasons behind that last week a little bit. So, and it doesn't explain especially what Zipporah means when she says afterward that stuff about you're now a batch or a bridegroom of blood to me. And what does she mean by that? And people really struggle with what on earth is Zipporah saying when she says that. So we can see all of these unexplained things that you have left over if you try to just see this as an ordinary circumcision. So we know that it isn't an ordinary circumcision. There's something very unordinary going on. And that's what we're going to dig into here. So the two key questions, the two main mysteries here are, believe it or not, there's a Cushite involved here. And we see that Cushite mentioned later on in the desert wanderings when they are out with the rest of the Israelites wandering around in the wilderness. And this comes from Numbers 12:1. And it says, Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. So Cushite means Ethiopian. We would now say that's an Ethiopian person. And we know that Ethiopians now are much the way they were for their skin color. They are dark black. And Abraham's people are just a little shade off of white. And so an Ethiopian would be easily recognizable in any household. And there wouldn't be any doubt about that. And so the Bible says that Zipporah is the daughter of Jethro, who's also called Reuel in other places. He seems to have a couple names, maybe even three names that he goes by. And so, and he is believed to be from Abraham. And so he would have been a shade off of white, and here's Zipporah, who's a dark black. And so how could Zipporah be Ethiopian if she's what Jethro calls a daughter? The Bible says repeatedly that that she's a daughter to him. And so how can that be? And so that's a really big question here is if she is the Cushite woman, then how can she be a daughter of Jethro? And so that's the big mystery. And some people ask, well, maybe Moses had another wife that just isn't mentioned here. But there is no mention of a second wife. Why would the Bible do that? Why would they mention a Cushite woman that he had married without ever talking about this wife? It seems kind of strange. And another thing that we see that's very strange here, and since I have my pointer out, I'll point it out. This here is pretty much a complete duplication of what's said above here. Why is the Bible going to the effort, the waste of ink, let's say, to say, for he had married a Cushite, when it just said that he had married a Cushite? And so that's another curiosity here. Why this duplication? It seems to be entirely pointless. But we know that God doesn't do pointless things. And so this is one of the big mysteries, is who is this Cushite woman? Is it Zipporah? If it's Zipporah, how can that be? And so if it isn't Zipporah, who is it? And the other big mystery is that whole blood of the bridegroom thing that she says after the circumcision. And I'll read that part of that. And it says, then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and threw it at Moses' feet. Remember, this translation says threw it at Moses' feet. And she said, you are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me. And then there's this repetition. It says, at that time she said, you are a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. So again, we're seeing a strange duplication there. And so everybody says, what on earth does Zipporah mean by this? What is she trying to say here? And there are lots of different guesses. Everybody has a different guess about it. And the translations are also a little different to that because they're having trouble understanding how to translate it because they don't understand what she's saying. And so one of them from NIV says, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. But of isn't actually in the Hebrew. They don't have a preposition in there. And so the Hebrew really just says bridegroom blood. And you have to fill in the preposition yourself. And so that's part of what the translators are also having trouble with. And then the New Living Translation says, now you are a bridegroom of blood to me. Well, that's different from surely. So which one of those is correct? And then King James Version says, surely a bloody husband art thou to me. And so now the husband has become a bloody husband. He's not just a bridegroom of blood, but a bloody husband. And so Strong's, the concordance that kind of tells us what these words mean, says that that and for and when are the different words that you can use for surely or now. And so you could say time is part of this. So the now translation of the New Living Translation might be a better translation. And surely probably isn't as good a translation there. And instead of bridegroom here, you could also say daughter's husband. And because of the Hebrew will translate both ways for that. So the translators are having trouble understanding what it means, and therefore they're coming up with different translations that way. And going back to that duplication again, this duplication is also interesting, and we're going to dig into that in the next slide. But here we are seeing exactly the same thing. Why is it repeating, you are a bridegroom of blood? And there has to be a reason. God has to have a reason for doing that. He is not wasteful that way. And so here's the key to understanding this. Here's our two big problems. The Cushite. No one knows how to fit this Cushite woman, wife in. And with the solution that most people do is they just ignore it. They just say, well, we don't know what that means, so we're just not going to pay any attention to it. And the other problem, the other big mystery is the bridegroom of blood thing. And there's no agreement on what Zipporah means when she says that. And so the duplication that I mentioned in both of those things, which is so similar between the two of them, a completely unnecessary passage is duplicated, unnecessarily duplicated, I should say. And so and that really calls our attention here. It says, look at this, there's something here. And what's happening here, and this is one of those different ways that God hides information in the Bible, is it links the idea in the one passage that Moses had married a Cushite woman to, in another passage, it says a bridegroom of Zipporah. Okay, and so they're really talking about the same thing. They're talking about a wife of Moses, and that's the main central theme to them. And so we know this wife of Moses is he had married a Cushite woman, and we know that Zipporah says that he's a bridegroom of hers by blood. And so this, when you join these two together, you find that there's an event in there and there's a person in there. And the event is had married, and that's past tense. That's the one where out in the wilderness it says he had married. And then what we see earlier on is when Zipporah says he's a bridegroom, that's present tense for them. And so these two are kind of jumping through time, and they're saying there's an event in past, and so that means something there. The linkage between bridegroom and husband or marriage in there, and a past and a present tense. And a person is also mentioned here. We see a Cushite woman, and we link that with Zipporah. And so what we can pull as 2 points from that is they become married at the time of the circumcision. When Zipporah says he's a bridegroom of blood, that's when they become married. And that, when you see that and think about that and think about what the rest of the verses say, you're going to have trouble understanding that. And I did. So you should have trouble too. And the second point is Zipporah is that Cushite woman. There's no doubt about it. And the Bible is making that clear by linking these two together, saying that she's the Cushite woman and they become married at the time of the circumcision. And so these two pieces of information are critical. If you don't have them, you can't solve the puzzle. But now that we have them, we can start solving the puzzle and making sense of a lot of things that don't make sense. Okay, so we'll start by looking at the first mention of Zipporah. And we're going to work our way up to the question of what is Zipporah, and this whole thing about if she's Ethiopian, Cushite, how is that possible? And so we looked at this verse before, but I'll repeat it again. This is Exodus 2:21. It says, Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Okay, so by that linkage, we know that Zipporah is an Ethiopian. And so how is it possible that she is a daughter? How does that happen at all? Why is a black-skinned Ethiopian in a household descended from light-skinned Abraham? So what is she doing in his household at all? And the answer to that is obvious when you think about it. She was a slave. She was born in the household of Jethro as a slave and is a slave now, which is given to Moses. And slave daughters were still called daughters. And we're going to see that come up again later, again, when we understand how slaves and slave wives work. And so she is properly referred to as a daughter because slavery didn't mean that much in the household. Slavery was how the person got into the household. But once they were part of the household, they were just a member of the household. They had their chores to do, they had things to do, and they did those things. They weren't a lesser kind of person, I guess, than maybe what I'm trying to say. And so she was just a slave because she was acquired that way. And so, but she's still called a daughter, just like all of the other daughters. So Jethro can refer to his biological daughters as daughters and also his slave daughters as daughters. And that doesn't maybe make sense to us because we have so little understanding of slavery in our time, but that would have made complete sense to them. Okay, so continuing on with this, and using that same verse, and now we're going to focus on the idea that Zipporah was given. And so that verse again says, Moses was willing to dwell with a man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Now we know this giving happens 30 plus years later, at least 30, almost 40 years later, and that she's given to him. And so, and many translations add to this something that's not in the Hebrew. They add to be his wife. And the Hebrew doesn't say that, but it's not wrong to say that. It's just confusing to us people who don't understand what a slave wife means. And so what we understand from Zipporah is that she was a slave wife. And that's different from a married wife. She wasn't a married wife. And that'll be critical to understand for some other things. And so, and slave wives are not at all uncommon. And we'll see some examples a little bit later when we talk about that in depth. And so she was given to Moses as a slave wife after 30 plus years of service. And that wasn't an uncommon thing either. You would often be given a slave wife or something like that had worked with the family for a long period of time. Even members of the family were given slaves. So at this time, though marrying Gentiles is not forbidden, the law of Moses hasn't come out yet. And so there isn't a written law that says that Abraham's people aren't supposed to be marrying Gentiles. But nonetheless, even in Moses' time, Israelites were avoiding marriage to Gentiles. There's a couple other references to that of them going back to their homeland to get wives. So taking a Gentile slave to be married wife was a rare thing and not unusual. We're going to see it here with Moses once we get into this further. And so when you took a Gentile slave as a wife, she remained a slave wife. She didn't become a married wife because of that, and not normally anyway. So it would be unusual for Moses to marry a Cushite woman without a good reason because she's a Gentile. And so that would have been something that they avoided at that time. And so that's what we won't see here. She is being given to him as a slave wife initially.
Starting to talk in common a little bit. I was doing my own research as you've been speaking, and they said, what is the significance of a Cushite in the Bible? I put in there. And it says Cushites are characteristically or largely militaristic people in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. So most references to Cush occur in the context of military engagement. So they were very warlike people, and until they were conquered in battle, and I guess that's how she must have been taken into slavery. So getting back to the question, why does he keep mentioning that he married a Cushite woman? In the context of that, I'm thinking it's because, well, this is who he married. She's a Cushite, which to them meant she's a warrior-like person. So she wasn't like some laid-back person at all.
Yeah, that might well be. And you're quite right about that. The Bible doesn't give any history of Zipporah up until that time, so we don't know how she came to be a slave. But one of those ways was certainly with conquered people. When you conquered a people, you often took the women as slaves and brought them into your household and gave them to your sons and daughters or whatever. And yes, daughters had slaves, women slaves as well. We see that with Abraham's wife. And so that's a good possibility that that's how she came to be a slave. But there were other possibilities. Sometimes people who were in financial debt and couldn't get out would sell their daughter. And so she might have been sold as well. The Bible just isn't clear on that, so I was going to leave it out. So right now, understanding a slave wife and what that means is important to us. And so a slave wife is referred to in the Bible as a wife. And so she was given to Moses to be a wife, but she's a slave wife, not a married wife. And that difference is important here. And so the owner of a slave wife could have children by her and then sell her or give her to someone else who might also have children by her. And to us, that seems kind of creepy, but that's what a slave life was like. You could be sold as a slave to anybody else if the people wanted to. Now, that wasn't normal to do that, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But you could also sell her children as slaves. They were slaves. They were born into slavery because she was a slave, and so they could be sold as slaves as well later on, and they could be sold with or without the mother. And so the slave life is not a desirable life for sure, and that's the way it works. So generally, though, slaves were not sold to someone outside of the household. They were family members. They were somebody you knew very closely, you worked with very closely, and it would be an unusual thing to do to sell them to somebody outside of the household. It was much more common to give them to someone within the household as a wife or as a slave to work for you. And so for a man, if you were the son of the father, the biological son, you might be given a slave to work with you, a man slave to work with you and help you do your responsibilities in the household. And so they could be given to someone in the family, or they could be earned by someone in the family by doing something. And so they normally stayed, though, within the household. But there are examples in the Bible where that doesn't happen. And one of them comes from Abraham. A troublemaker slave wife might be dumped because she's just a source of constant trouble and she's just not worth it. And Abraham, as I said, ran into that situation with Hagar. Um, Hagar was causing all kinds of trouble. And so what he did was he freed her as a slave and sent her away. And so she was no longer a slave. She was a free person, but she was also kicked out of the household and sent out that way. And so that could happen to a slave, but it couldn't happen to a married wife. So slave wives are not unusual in the Bible at all. And God never had a problem with that practice. He never says anything against that. In fact, 4 of the 12 tribes are mothered by slave wives. So of the 12, 4 of them came from the slaves who were the slaves of the other wives. So a slave wife in the Bible was usually just called a wife, and unless there was some reason to make a distinction and make it clear. And with Abraham, you do see that because you understand that her slave was given to him to be his wife. And so you know that she's a slave wife there. But in many cases, you don't know that she was a slave wife because it really wasn't that important in most cases. In our case, it's going to be really important to understand that. And so and her slave sons were called sons. They weren't. You didn't necessarily say that they were slave sons unless there was some reason to differentiate them and make it clear that you're talking about a son who is a slave. And that can really confuse us. We don't know anything of slavery and how all these slavery things work. So if you don't understand that, you're going to miss some other things that need to be understood here. So, summarizing a bit of that, we know that Ethiopia is the place that she came from. She's going to be dark skinned. She is the Cushite woman, and that she's also a slave. And so she has her first baby right away and very quick. And this is the verse that comes right after verse 21. And so it says that she was given to him, and then the verse continues on and says, then she gave birth to a son, and he, Moses, named him Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. So this is the very next verse, and it says in the very next verse that she gives birth. And there's no mention here that Moses and her were together. Very often in the Bible, you'll see phrases like he knew her or he laid with her or something like that to make it clear. Here you don't see that. There's no indication of that. You also don't see any mention that this child is Moses' son. And so almost certainly the child is not, which means that almost certainly she was pregnant, although maybe not visibly pregnant, when she was given to Moses. And so she has, because of whatever previous relationship she had, she already has a child within her. And so Moses names the boy, and that's the right of the owner of a slave, is that you would name the children that were born out of the slavery. And he gives the name that makes sense only if the boy is also a wanderer. So he gives the name to the boy of wanderer, and he says it's because he's been a wanderer. But why would you give your son a name like wanderer unless he's also a wanderer? And so it makes sense that the boy is a wanderer because he is an Ethiopian far away from Ethiopia. And so the name that he's given to the boy also makes it pretty clear that he sees him as being a person who's a long ways away from his homeland, as Moses is also. Okay, so continue on with the son being born. There's no mention at all that the boy is circumcised, and that's a little bit odd. Um, Remember, by this time, Moses has spent like 38 or 39 years with this family who knows circumcision, and we know that they know circumcision because Zipporah shows that she has a really deep understanding of circumcision. And so, why would Moses fail to circumcise his son? He would know that that's the right thing to do, and it would have been made clear to it. He probably would have seen lots of circumcisions, and so he would know that. And so, why doesn't he circumcise that son? And the wife of an Israelite, how would she allow him to go uncircumcised if she was understanding this? And so we see something interesting here that also indicates that this is not the biological son of Moses. And we know, as I said before, that circumcision was a well-known thing, and Moses would have known that that was what was required by God given to Abraham. So Zipporah was already pregnant when she was given to Moses. We don't know if that was visible or not, and we know that she wasn't married to him. It wasn't a marital wife. She was a slave wife. And because of these things, and the indication that this boy is not his biological son, Moses seems to feel no compunction at all to circumcise that Gentile boy. He probably just sees him as a Gentile. He's not part of Abraham's crowd, and therefore there's no reason to circumcise him. Okay, now I'm going to actually stop there. My time is up here, and we'll pick this up again next week. I knew there'd become a point where we needed to do that, but I got past the important things. We understand now a lot about who Zipporah is. She's an Ethiopian. She's a Cushite, as the Bible says. She is a slave. She is a slave wife now to Moses. She's given birth to a son who is almost certainly not the biological son of Moses, and that's where we'll pick it up next week. We'll go from there.